When we think of ancient empires, we often picture glorious conquests, emperors forging legacies with fire and steel. But some of the most compelling stories aren't found on the battlefield. They're whispered in shadowy throne rooms and sealed with a dagger in the dead of night. These are the stories of just holding on, of keeping a fragile empire together, not through expansion but through sheer force of will. The Achaemenid Persian Empire was the largest the world had ever seen, a giant of staggering power and wealth. But immense power breeds envy, and wealth attracts predators, not just from outside the borders but from deep within the palace. This is the story of a king who inherited a throne soaked in his own father's blood. A ruler whose reign of about 40 years would be defined not by the lands he conquered, but by the enemies he simply outlasted. How are you, friends? I am Czar. We uncover the truth from our history. If you are passionate about it, have a look at our series of French, Byzantine, and Persian empires in playlist. We love your support in improving our service by subscribing, sharing, liking, and leaving special comments to keep us going and serve you better. In 465 BC, the heart of this global empire was plunged into chaos. The King of Kings, Xerxes the Great, the man who had burned Athens, lay murdered in his bed. He wasn't killed by a foreign enemy, but by his own inner circle. From this bloody turmoil, one son would rise to claim the throne, Artaxerxes I. His story isn't one of glorious conquest, but of something far more difficult: survival. This is the chronicle of a king who had to fight a superpower abroad while surrounded by assassins at home, a reign of constant warfare and deadly betrayal, where just holding on to power was the ultimate victory. To truly grasp the world Artaxerxes was thrown into, we have to go back to the final days of his father, Xerxes I. After the humiliating defeats in Greece, the great king's ambitions for Western conquest were shattered. He returned to Persia a changed man, retreating from the battlefield and into the gilded cage of his palaces at Susa and Persepolis. There, he poured his energy into lavish building projects, funded by heavy taxes that stirred resentment across his vast empire. But the real danger wasn't brewing in the streets. It was festering right in the corridors of power. The Persian court was a snake pit of intrigue, and later Greek sources delighted in spicing up their histories with scandalous court gossip, such as a supposed romance between Xerxes and his own niece. Whether any of that is true, it's clear Xerxes didn't see the conspiracy tightening around him. According to several Greek writers, the man at the center of the plot was a figure named Artabanus, the commander of the royal bodyguard. Holding one of the most powerful positions in the empire, Artabanus was closer to the king than anyone. In August of 465 BC, he allegedly used this privileged access to enter the king's bedchamber and murder Xerxes in his sleep. But killing the king was only the first step. To secure power, Artabanus had to eliminate the heirs, and it's here that the ancient sources disagree, leaving us with a very murky picture. One of the most dramatic accounts, from the historian Ctesias, reads like a masterpiece of manipulation. In his version, Artabanus went straight to Xerxes' third son, a young prince named Artaxerxes, and framed the crown prince, Darius, for the murder. He supposedly convinced Artaxerxes that his own brother had killed their father and that it was his duty to seek revenge. Fueled by these lies, Artaxerxes confronted Darius, who was likely stunned by the accusation, and had him promptly executed. In a single night, one of Xerxes' sons was dead, apparently at the hand of the other. Artabanus, the puppet master, now positioned himself as the protector of the new young king. For a few months, he was the true power behind the Persian throne, but he had severely underestimated the boy he helped install. Artaxerxes was now the king of kings, but he was a king in name only, a puppet whose strings were held by his father's killer. The young monarch was surrounded by Artabanus's men, his every move scrutinized. He must have known that the man who manipulated him into killing his own brother wouldn't hesitate to eliminate him too. Every meal could be poisoned. Every shadow could hide an assassin. Survival meant outplaying the master of betrayal. How exactly Artaxerxes managed to turn the tables is a matter of historical debate. One version suggests that a powerful general named Megabyzus, who may have been part of the initial conspiracy, switched sides and warned Artaxerxes of another looming assassination attempt. A more dramatic account from the historian Diodorus Siculus describes a direct confrontation. The story goes that Artabanus, finally ready to seize the throne for himself, drew his sword on the young king. But the blow wasn't fatal. Artaxerxes, though wounded, fought back and killed the man who had torn his family apart. Whatever the precise truth may be, Artaxerxes emerged victorious. He was no longer a pawn, he was the king. But the bloodshed was far from over. Artaxerxes moved swiftly to consolidate his power, launching a bloody purge against Artabanus's remaining allies. This sent a clear and brutal message to the Persian nobility. The new king was no naive boy. He was a survivor, forged in betrayal and prepared to do whatever it took to secure his throne. His grasp on power, however, was still fragile. As news of the chaos in the capital spread, another older brother, Hystaspes, who governed the remote eastern province of Bactria, saw an opportunity and launched a rebellion. Ancient sources tell us that Artaxerxes had to march his army east to confront this civil war, eventually crushing his brother's forces and cementing his authority over the entire empire. But just as he stamped out this internal fire, a much larger one was erupting in the west. While Artaxerxes was busy securing his throne, the satrapy of Egypt, the wealthiest and most rebellious province in the empire, saw its chance. Around 460 BC, a Libyan prince named Inarus, with ties to the old Egyptian dynasties, raised the banner of rebellion, and the revolt spread like wildfire. In a major battle at Paprimus, the rebels annihilated the local Persian army. Its commander, a man named Achaemenes, who was Artaxerxes' own uncle, was killed in the fight. This was more than just a local uprising. Inarus knew he couldn't face the full might of Persia alone, so he made a brilliant move. He asked Athens for help. At the time, Athens was at the peak of its power. Seeing a golden opportunity to weaken their Persian rivals and gain access to Egypt's valuable grain supply, they diverted a massive fleet, said to be around 200 ships, and sailed for the Nile. With Athenian soldiers and ships reinforcing them, the rebels gained the upper hand for a time. For Artaxerxes, this was an existential threat. Losing Egypt would be a devastating blow, a signal to the world that the King of Kings was weak. He could not let that happen. His first move was classic Persian strategy: gold. He dispatched a diplomat to Sparta to bribe them into attacking Athens, hoping this would force a recall of the Athenian fleet from Egypt. When that failed, Artaxerxes had no choice but to respond with overwhelming force. He assembled a massive army and placed it under the command of one of his most capable generals, Megabyzus. Around 456 BC, the Persian counterattack began. Megabyzus marched his army into Egypt and, after a long and brutal campaign, broke the siege of Memphis and defeated the main Egyptian army. The rebels and their Athenian allies retreated to an island in the Nile called Prosopidus. There, Megabyzus besieged them for what the historian Thucydides reports was 18 long months. In a remarkable feat of engineering, his forces reportedly diverted the river by digging canals, which stranded the Athenian ships and allowed the Persians to storm the now dry land. The rebellion was crushed, and the Athenian expedition ended in a complete and utter disaster. The victory in Egypt should have been a moment of ultimate triumph for Artaxerxes, but in the Persian court, it seemed every victory planted the seeds of a new betrayal. The man who would trigger the next crisis was none other than the hero of the Egyptian war, Megabyzus. When the rebel leader Inarus and the captured Greek commanders surrendered, Megabyzus gave his word that their lives would be spared. But back in the capital, the queen mother, Amestris, widow of Xerxes, demanded revenge for the death of her son Achaemenes during the revolt. The account from Cadyceus, who reveled in this kind of palace drama, claims she relentlessly pressured Artaxerxes to execute the prisoners. Megabyzus was furious. He had given a sacred pledge. This left Artaxerxes trapped between his most powerful general and his formidable mother. In the end, he yielded to Amestris. Inarus was executed along with a number of Greek officers, a brutal violation of the surrender terms. For Megabyzus, this was an unforgivable insult. He returned to his post in Syria and did the unthinkable. He rebelled against the king. This was no mere provincial uprising. This was a rebellion led by the empire's most successful general. According to Cadyceus's dramatic and likely embellished account, Artaxerxes sent army after army against Megabyzus, only to see them all defeated. Realizing he could not win on the battlefield, the king was forced to negotiate. In the end, Megabyzus was pardoned and allowed to return to court. But the peace was uneasy. The storyteller Ctesias gives us another fantastic anecdote. During a royal lion hunt, a lion charged the king. Megabyzus, acting quickly, threw his spear and killed the beast, saving the king's life but also committing a grave offense. No one was permitted to throw their spear before the king. For this, Artaxerxes ordered him executed, but was again talked down, this time commuting the sentence to exile. The whole saga of Megabyzus, while likely exaggerated in the telling, perfectly illustrates just how paranoid and dangerous Artaxerxes' court could be. While the drama with Egypt and Megabyzus unfolded, the long-standing Cold War with Athens simmered on. Both sides were growing weary of the endless conflict. Artaxerxes realized that his father's and grandfather's strategy of large-scale invasion was costly and ultimately ineffective. He was searching for a more stable way to manage the Greeks. Athens, too, was feeling the strain of constant warfare on its treasury and manpower. Around 449 BC, some form of agreement was reached, known as the Peace of Callias, named after the Athenian diplomat who supposedly negotiated it. Now, whether this was a formal written treaty is a huge debate among historians. Our best contemporary source, Thucydides, never mentions it. But whether it was a signed pact or simply a practical understanding, the fighting between Athens and Persia effectively came to a halt. The reported terms were that Persia would recognize the independence of the Greek cities in modern-day Turkey and keep its warships out of the Aegean Sea. In return, Athens agreed to cease meddling in Persian territory, including places like Egypt and Cyprus. This peace was a quiet, strategic victory for Artaxerxes. It secured his western frontier and ended the direct military threat from Athens that had plagued his dynasty for half a century. More importantly, it marked a fundamental shift in Persian foreign policy. Artaxerxes and his successors began to embrace a more subtle and effective strategy, checkbook diplomacy. He realized the greatest threat to Athens wasn't the Persian army, but other Greeks. By strategically sending money to Athens' rivals, particularly Sparta, he could keep the Greek world divided and consumed by its own conflicts. It was a quieter kind of victory, but a victory nonetheless. The final decade of Artaxerxes' long reign was one of relative stability, a stark contrast to its violent beginning. With Egypt pacified and a tense peace with Athens holding, he was able to focus on internal matters. He continued the grand building projects at the ceremonial capital of Persepolis that his father had initiated, completing the magnificent hall of 100 columns and constructing his own palace. It is also during this period that Artaxerxes appears in the Hebrew Bible, in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. Though scholars debate some of the exact timelines, the Bible credits Artaxerxes with continuing Persia's policy of religious tolerance. According to the text, he gave his royal cupbearer, a Jewish man named Nehemiah, permission and resources to go to Jerusalem and rebuild its shattered walls. This was a position of immense trust. The cupbearer's primary role was to taste the king's wine to check for poison. By empowering a loyal official to govern Judea, Artaxerxes was likely creating a stable, pro-Persian buffer state near the rebellious border of Egypt. He also reportedly authorized the priest Ezra to return to Jerusalem to establish the Mosaic Law. In a final ironic twist to a reign that began with his father's war against Greece, Artaxerxes also granted asylum to his father's greatest nemesis, Themistocles. The brilliant Athenian general, the architect of the Greek victory at Salamis, had been exiled from his own city. He fled to Persia and threw himself on the mercy of the son of the very man he had defeated. Artaxerxes not only welcomed him, but granted him several cities to provide his income. In 424 BC, after a reign of roughly 41 years, Artaxerxes I died, apparently of natural causes. This in itself was perhaps his greatest achievement. He inherited a throne through murder, survived a civil war, crushed the largest rebellion the empire had ever faced, navigated the treacherous politics of his own court, and outlasted all his enemies. He died peacefully in his bed, a feat his father and many of his successors could not manage. His death, however, immediately plunged the empire back into the chaos he had so long held at bay. His only legitimate son, Xerxes II, was murdered just 45 days after taking the throne by a half-brother, who was then killed by another half-brother, who would go on to rule as Darius II. This brief, bloody free-for-all only served to highlight the stability Artaxerxes had maintained for 4 long decades. The reign of Artaxerxes I is not a story of glorious conquest. His name is not as famous as Cyrus, Darius, or his father Xerxes. His is a legacy that is quieter and far more complex. He was not a conqueror, he was a survivor. His reign was a 40-year tightrope walk over a pit of blood and betrayal. He inherited an empire in chaos and, through a combination of ruthless force, clever diplomacy, and sheer endurance, he held it all together. He battled rebels and their Athenian allies not for glory but for the very survival of his empire. He navigated a court where his most trusted general could become his most dangerous enemy. He changed Persian grand strategy, trading the sword for the purse, and found more success in funding Greece's self-destruction than his predecessors had found in trying to conquer it. He died a king in his own bed, leaving behind an empire that was, at least for a moment, at peace. The story of Artaxerxes I is a powerful reminder that in the brutal world of ancient empires, sometimes the greatest victory isn't winning new lands, but simply refusing to lose the ones you already have. If you found this journey into the treacherous world of the Persian court compelling, be sure to subscribe and press the bell icon for more deep dives into the forgotten corners of ancient history. Let us know in the comments which overlooked monarch or lost civilization you'd like us to explore next. Thank you for watching.